who in here has used, or their company uses AIA as their kind of base template? Okay. Who in here uses consensus docs as kind of their base template? Do we have anybody that refuses to use either as their templates and kind of completely goes their own way?
We use a lot of AGC as well.
Okay. And so then my next question is here, of the folks that use AIA as your templates, what player in the industry are you? Are you an architect or are you
We're an AE firm.
Okay.
So, yeah, we use the AGC contracts for a lot of our municipal public work on the civil side.
Okay.
And AIA contracts for our vertical construction.
Sure. Okay. And how about you, if you don't mind me asking?
GC.
Okay. So just a little kind of background of what consensus docs and AIA are for any of you who are not overly familiar with them. But they kind of run. Consensus docs is much newer, and it's a consensus, as you might guess, of players in the industry. So it's going to be design professionals are going to be involved in it, but it's also going to be contractors, GCs, maybe subs, owners, those kind of things. It's going to be a consensus, is what they have presented anyways, of all of the players that have gone into these, that have provided thought into these template contracts. AIA has been around forever, and it is from the American Institute of Architects, as you might guess. And what that means is it's going to be slanted towards the architect. It's going to be deferential to the architect. Not necessarily a bad thing or a good thing. Depends on the project. Everything is project specific. But they came about from the American Institute of Architects. So there's no question that it's drafted with that, from that eye, from that perspective. They're a little bit different format too, the way they work. So the AIA has like 4 or 5 page contracts for your different relationships. You're going to have owner to contractor, then contractor to set. It's going to be a couple page, 3 or 4 page contract, but it's going to then incorporate this A201, which is their general terms and conditions, and that's going to be incorporated in basically every AIA agreement that you see. And that's the meat. I mean, that's the 30-some page everything. The smaller contract is really not much to it. Consensus docs is different. They don't do a general terms and conditions that's incorporated into every contract. They just have the contract. And they're going to have a different contract for your different relationships, whichever part of the relationship you are. So it's just one document. So what we're looking at today, what we're going to be comparing when we're talking about terms, is the A201, the general terms and conditions from AIA. And we're not going to look at their specific agreements. We don't have 8 hours to deal with you guys, nor do you want to listen to us for that long. And then we're going to compare it with a consensus doc that is the similar. So it's basically the owner to contractor agreement. Consensus doc calls it constructor. No offense to anyone who uses consensus docs. We're not taking a position in here today, but that term drives me crazy. So you're probably going to just hear me say contractor because it's what I'm used to saying. Here's some of the terms that we're going to actually look at. The 3 of us will talk to you today about kind of where some differences are in these terms. And what we've tried to do is prioritize, pick out a few of the terms that we think may be most interesting or of most importance to you when you're looking at your project agreements, and then we're going to just compare. You're not going to hear me today tell you that one is better than the other. What I will tell you, from my opinion, is that usually something that's one size fits all doesn't really fit anything perfectly. That's the way we feel about it. So they're great starting points. Both of them have a lot handled for you. That's the purpose, right? And they're definitely better than going at it your own way with no counsel involved and just trying to pull something off the internet or start on your own. But it doesn't necessarily mean that a template contract is the best idea for every project that you might have. Before I get into those, or we get into those terms, the specific terms differences, the biggest difference we have between AIA and consensus docs is going to be the history. And from a litigator's perspective, that's a powerful difference. Again, it doesn't necessarily mean that we like AIA better, but what we do know is just about every provision in an AIA agreement has been read and reread and interpreted by almost every jurisdiction. Consensus docs has less time in the market, so they just don't have that yet. Over time they will, but they haven't had the same level of litigation over the provisions because they've only been around since about 2007. Which, when you're looking at it from a litigator's perspective, if you come to me and you say, Sean, I've got this dispute over this provision, and it's from an AIA provision, I would say, well, I don't, I'm not familiar with that off the top of my head, but I'll research it, and I can almost guarantee you I'm going to find an answer somewhere. There's a court that's addressed this exact type of dispute over this language in this provision. Consensus docs might be, we get to argue whatever we want. We don't know yet. There hasn't been any ruling on this type of a dispute. So we get to look at the language of the contract and be creative with what we think it should mean. And there hasn't been a lot of litigation on what it actually should mean. That can be a good thing and that can be a bad thing. It all depends on the project, or all depends on your position in it. The unknown may be better than the adverse known, right? I mean, if you have a known result and it's not the results you were hoping for out of the provision, well, then we'd rather have it be unknown and be able to make an argument about it. So it just kind of depends on which side of the coin you find yourself on. But that's what we kind of refer to as the invisible difference or hidden difference between them. If you just look at contract terms together, I mean, that's not going to jump off the page at you, right? But when you're talking about it in the legal context and actually dealing with a dispute in it, if you have historical data and historical opinions from multiple jurisdictions on what this specific provision is intended to mean, well then the unknown, you don't have nearly as many unknowns. Excuse me. And then I apologize in advance, but we're attorneys, so we are by no means above laughing at ourselves, and so we had to have a little bit of comedic relief here for the architects in the room. And if you have any good attorney joke, it will not hurt any of our feelings to chime in at any time. I'll kick it over to Brian here, and then I'll be back up and talk to you guys here in a little bit.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. To start, at least from a legal perspective, the contract, the material terms are obviously scope of work, consideration, how much people are going to get paid and everything. From a legal perspective, when I'm asked to look at the contract, the thing that probably I care about the most is risk allocation, and how the risk that can arise from a construction project, how that risk is allocated. Let's kind of, before you can move into risk allocation, you have to kind of talk about where those risks come from. And I've broken it down into 3 different areas where, at least from, again, a legal perspective, I see risks in any construction project. And I probably have them a little out of order. I'll talk about between the parties first, which is going to be the parties to the contracts, architects, engineers, contractors, subs, suppliers, etc., owner. When you talk about risk between the parties, from my perspective, it always boils down to expectations. When a dispute arises between the parties, it's usually because someone's expectations, rightfully or wrongfully, have not been met. And so there's a few of them up there. I cut my teeth in the practice of law on construction defect litigation. It's from a legal perspective entertaining, but they are as complex of a litigation matter as I've handled, because it involves, usually if something has gone wrong on a large project, multiple parties are brought into the litigation. They last longer. Litigation lasts a long time. Most lawyers will tell you that if you walk in for the first meeting and you've been sued, it lasts way longer than you'd expect. Construction defect case had double it. And so they're definitely a huge area of risk. I've also handled quite a bit of project delay litigation, and then obviously scope of work issues, whether it's who should have done this work, who's supposed to do this work. Payment issues, again, are going to arise from time to time. Second area where you can see risk is with third parties. Again, from my experience, most of that comes from a personal injury perspective, whether it's during project or probably more importantly after the project. Construction's done, something happens, there's an injury, and someone claims not only was it as a result of maintenance, it was a result of some sort of construction design defect or a construction defect. And obviously personal injury claims come with potential catastrophic results, and also come with the baggage of maybe emotions that you don't see in property damage cases. And the other two I have up there are property damage and nuisance claims. Property damage would be big blasting case, surrounding neighborhoods, claim damage from the blasting. Nuisance claims, the ones I've seen mostly in my experience have been like a water diversion case where the construction has diverted water in a way that wasn't intended, or at least wasn't allegedly intended, and results in flooding in some other area. And then last but not least, regulatory risks, whether it's OSHA, safety-related, EPA, basic background type of risks you might see in a construction project. So then the question becomes, how do you allocate those risks? And that's where you kind of get into the meat of any good construction contract. And so what I'm going to do today, at least to start, is talk about 3 areas where you see in a construction contract risk allocation. One is in the area of insurance. One would be indemnification provisions, and then the last I have up there are additional insured or waiver provisions. The insurance here on this slide. So insurance is, again, one of those critical elements of any construction contract. There's numerous types of insurance that you're going to need in a construction contract. The good news about the 2 template documents we're talking about, consensus docs and AIAs, they both do a very good job of laying out the various types of insurance you might need. And so from that perspective, they're both very good. Types of insurance we're talking about are going to be commercial general liability, which is your basic, covers most things type of insurance. Work comp, which you've run a company for any length of time, you've dealt with work comp insurance. Completed operations coverage, builder's risk coverage, which obviously covers risks during the project, and then professional liability coverage, which is going to be more specific for design professionals. And this is kind of my favorite time to give my favorite warning on any issue in a contract, but particularly when it comes to insurance. I can't emphasize enough the importance of consistency throughout the project contracts. If anyone comes to me and says, would you review my construction contract that someone's proposed or that I want to propose, the first thing I'm going to say is I need to see the other contracts, because we've got to figure out if they're consistent with each other, because if they're not, that's where some real problems can happen. That's particularly true with insurance. And if there's a reason to rely, at least in part, on template contracts, it's one of them, I think, is insurance, because they do such a good job of covering it. Anyone in the room have a physics degree? I don't either, but my physics lessons of the day would be, do you know what is it Newton's third law is? I didn't, before last night at least, I didn't know that's what it was called. But it's every action has an equal and opposite reaction, which you probably heard it before. I can't tell you what that means in physics, other than I know it involves atoms and protons and things like that. But it may be applicable in physics, but one place where I don't think it's applicable is in insurance and insurance coverage. Because a small mistake on insurance, in ensuring your I's aren't dotted and your T's crossed, can again result in catastrophic consequences. So small mistake, not necessarily equal and opposite reaction. So that's my soapbox. One warning as a lawyer that I hope to give you today. Again, I think I've already covered it, but from the insurance perspective, the difference between the 2 templates, the truth is they both do a pretty good job of covering what type of insurance you're going to need in your project. They lay it out a little differently, as Sean's already talked about, and it's just in the way they format it. AIA has actually, in their most recent version, pulled almost all the insurance stuff into their base contract with an Exhibit A. I don't really have a background on as to why they did it, but it's now all kind of focused in there, whereas the general conditions used to have it, where consensus doc, every form or template contract has the insurance right in the meat of the insurance coverage right in the need of the project, so it's more of a format over substance issue. The one area that as I kind of looked through them both again and was trying to find areas of difference that I found, it's probably not a huge difference, but I thought it was interesting, in part because I've handled a lot of cases where the builder's risk insurance has been involved, is there's a slight difference. In consensus docs, the contractor is initially spearheaded with purchasing the insurance, builder's risk insurance, unless the owner says he wants to or she wants to, but it obviously gets charged back to the owner. But the one thing that I liked or thought was interesting about consensus docs is if there is a loss and there's a deductible, it now reads that the person primarily responsible for the loss pays the deductible, whereas under the AIA, the owner purchases the insurance and then also pays the deductible. Additional insured status is another issue I'm going to cover briefly, which maybe you guys all know what that is, but generally you'll see it in every construction contract, at least every template I've ever seen. It says, me, subcontractor, agrees to make general contractor an additional insured under my insurance. It's essentially a way to delegate insurance responsibility, for lack of a better term. Comparing the two documents, AIA requires that the contractor will include both the owner and an architect as an additional insured on their commercial general liability policy, and that for any claims caused in whole or in part, and that's the key language there for a slide or two later, for whole or in part for the negligence of the contractor. That's what the AIA general conditions say. Consensus docs does it a little differently. They have three options, check one option. The first is do nothing. The second, make the owner an additional insured. And then the third is owners and contractors protected liability insurance, which is essentially a separate insurance coverage you buy separate of your own insurance. The other good things or interesting thing about consensus docs, which isn't surprising, is it doesn't require additional insured status for the architect. If you go back up to AIA, if you're a general contractor and you're required to cover an architect as an additional insured, be careful because your CGL is probably not going to do that because they're a design professional and coverage for that is not likely to fall within there. So it's something to keep in mind. Consensus docs, they're not a part of it. It also limits it just to damages from the negligence of the contractor. A little bit different is up there, it's in whole or in part from the negligence of the contractor. And then any additional cost of the insurance under consensus docs is paid for by the owner. Waiver of subrogation claims or provisions. Again, it's an area where I find very fascinating. I'm shocked if anyone here would agree that it's fascinating. But it's kind of put it into perspective. It's I own the property, I've had a property loss, my insurance comes in and pays for it. My insurance company says, man, this was the fault of the general contractor. I'm going to go after, the insurance company then goes after a general contractor and says, hey, your insurance should pay for the loss. It's essentially a way for one insurance company to subrogate against another insurance company if you're insured. It's used a lot. We see it all the time in litigation. Construction contracts typically have, under certain circumstances, waivers of that subrogation right. In part because we're trying to allocate risk at the outset, right? Who's going to pay for what? Then let's try to avoid litigation later. And so that's what the waiver of subrogation provision is. Let's try to avoid litigation if at all possible, because that's why we have insurance out there. AIA, well, so to not bore you with the details, I'll break it down like this. They both have good waiver of subrogation provisions. Consensus docs is a little bit more concise and simple, and maybe not as full. It doesn't provide as much coverage as AIA does. The AIA waiver of subrogation provision is more complex But I also think, and I've litigated it, I've never litigated waiver of subrogation under consensus docs, but under the AIA, I've had multiple cases involving waiver of subrogation clauses, and it is very broad. And as an example, I have a case pending right now involving a fire suppression system failure. We represent the sub who installed the fire suppression system. General contractor owner sells business. 8 years later, new buyers there, system fails. So I have 8 years later, I have a new buyer, new purchaser, and case isn't over yet, so I may be wrong. Come talk to me in another year or so. But I'm making an argument that I think is a very strong argument, that under that original contract, the new buyer's claim is barred because the new buyer's claim was covered by their insurance. And that under their successor in interest under that contract, and therefore that insurance company's claim is waived, even though they had nothing to do with the contract 8 years ago. I don't think I can make that argument under consensus docs based on my reading of the language. And I think Sean touched on this a little bit. There is not a lot of case law out there on consensus docs, and if you read their literature, they're proud of that because they say it's so simple to read. There's not a lot of litigation. It may be true, may not be true. A lot of it, I think, has to do with the fact that it's still relatively new. I do think that there are provisions in it that are simpler, and maybe for the better in some places. But when it comes to waiver of subrogation, I tend to like the language of the AIA just because I'm comfortable with it. There you go. That's what I just said. A couple statutes in Kansas that are kind of important. KSA 16803B deals with waiver of subrogation, and it says that you cannot, it's against public policy and construction contracts to waive the right of subrogation for claims covered or paid by liability or work comp insurance. It's frankly a statute that has little interpretation and not a lot of legislative history. There's a lot of anti-waiver of subrogation statutes out there in other states. Ours is a little different, and so I can't tell you exactly how this plays out. My argument in my case is it wasn't covered by liability or workers' compensation. It was covered by property insurance, and so this doesn't matter to me. But it's a statute that's out there that may potentially affect any waiver of subrogation provision you have in your contract. And 16121 is another interesting provision that says that you cannot require, again, I'm a subcontractor, general contractor can't make general contractor an additional insured under my contract, under my insurance, for the general contractor's negligence. Meaning I can't insure someone else for their own negligence. It's again kind of a public policy argument that's been put into statute. If you read that statute and compare it to the AIA contract, the AIA contract as written probably violates that because it says I'll make you an additional insured for in whole or in part for my negligence. Well, in part means it could also be for your negligence, which I'm not allowed to do that under the statute. So just some Kansas specific things to keep in mind. We'll go until 2:45, right?
Yeah.
All right. Indemnification, another great, really exciting topic, but even though it's probably not that exciting, it is once again a relatively important topic when you're talking about risk allocation. And I'm guessing you've all dealt with indemnification language in a contract before, but again, it's if something goes wrong, it's similar to an additional insured status, but it's a little bit different. And usually both of them are within a contract, and it says if something goes wrong and insured fault, and I get sued, you're going to indemnify me for it. So what are the similarities in AIA and consensus docs? One, both of them require the contractor to indemnify owners and design professionals for any claims of bodily injury or property damage. It's only to the extent caused by the negligent acts or omissions of the contractor or its agents, which could be subcontractors, suppliers, subs potentially. And then something that's interesting, which I could talk about for a long time, but I won't, is it does require the payment of their attorney's fees, but it doesn't have a defense obligation, which means you don't have to necessarily defend them, but you do have to indemnify them and pay their attorney's fees. Some people, even without a defense obligation, will say, hey, how about I go ahead and pick up the defense too, because then I can have a little more control over the defense and the cost of the defense. But neither of them require a duty to defend. So those are some similarities. Difference, both of them, again, say will require indemnification for property damage, but consensus docs, both of them then essentially say, you're going to cover indemnifying for property damage, but not if it's already covered by a builder's risk policy. Again, because we're allocating risk. We have that policy for a reason. Why create additional litigation? Not going to require that. Consensus docs takes it a little bit further than AIA and says, not just builder's risk, but if there's any policy in place that's covered this loss, we're not going to require indemnification. Again, it's a great example of risk allocation, trying to avoid litigation in the future. Another couple interesting things that consensus docs does that AIA doesn't is consensus docs has a reciprocal indemnification. AIA general contract says contractor, you're going to indemnify owner, architect. Consensus docs says owner, if it's your fault, you're going to indemnify general contractor. Again, it's consensus docs way I think of at least attempting to level the playing field or at least make it a little more fair. And then they have a language in there too that says that to the extent the indemnifier, the person that is required to indemnify is entitled to reimbursement for any defense costs paid above their respective percentage of liability for the underlying claim. Attempting to level the playing field, but I'll be honest, when I read that concept, I think it opens up huge potential litigation issues, primarily because, at least in my experience, even if there's indemnifying language in the contract, if something's gone wrong, everyone's going to be in the case. Everyone's going to be in the case, and most likely they're all going to have their separate counsel. So what happens after the fact if they're both already defending the case, but you have that provision? You have both paid your attorney. One's more at fault than the other. Now do you have to pay another attorney fee on top of it because of that language? It just seems to me to potentially have some unintended consequences. I'll go a few more minutes and pass it along. Standard of care, in my world, standard of care means basically that you're going to act in a manner consistent with your area of profession. That's kind of the common law legal term. But in a contract, it's kind of what does the contract require of you as far as how you're going to perform your obligations. Specific to the general contractor agreement, consensus doc says you're going to provide all labor, material, equipment necessary to complete the work. You're going to supervise and coordinate the work. And then they have this language in there that you see a lot in Kansas law, that you're going to do the work in a workmanlike manner. What's that mean? Yeah, it means whatever the expert you hire to defend you says it means, or whatever the expert that the other person hired says it doesn't mean. But it is what it is. It says it's going to be done in a workmanlike manner. AIA does it slightly differently, and it says you're going to perform the contract in accordance with the contract document. So it basically says, what does the contract say? What are you supposed to do? That's how you're going to perform it. Again, it has the language in there. It says the contract's going to supervise the work to the best skill and attention. Both of them have this language. It says the contractor shall be solely responsible for the construction means, methods, techniques, sequences, procedures of carrying out the work, which is interesting, and I'll get to it here. On this, basically, the long and the short of it is, they use different language. I don't think they're that much different. One area where I saw a little bit of a difference is on that contractor shall be responsible for construction means, techniques, sequences. Under consensus docs, it says you're responsible for it, but if the contract says do it this way, it provides you a little more protection. If you follow the contract, unless you know you're doing something that's bad, you have a little protection in the contract documents where the AIA puts a little bit more of an affirmative obligation on the contractor to identify issues that I don't see as much in the consensus docs. Warranty issues which fall within the issues of standard of care, and we thought a good time for a video. You might need to turn it up a little
Something
bit.
that's enjoyable.
Good. Of course it does. Why shouldn't it? You figure you put that little box under your pillow at night, the guaranteed fairy might come by and leave a quarter. Am I right, Ted?
What's your point?
The point is, how do you know the fairy isn't a crazy glue sniffer? Building on an airplane, says the little fairy. Well, we're not buying it. He sneaks into your house once, that's all it takes. Next thing you know, there's money missing off the dresser and your daughter's knocked up. I've seen it 100 times.
But why do they put a guarantee on the box then?
Because they know all they sold you was a guaranteed piece of shit. That's all it is, isn't it? Hey, if you want me to take a dump in a box and mark it guaranteed, I will. I got spare time. But for now, for your customer's sake, for your daughter's sake, you might want to think about buying a quality product from me.
Okay,
That's talking about a guarantee, which obviously I think is a funny take on it. I think warranties have value, and pretty much every construction contract is going to have a warranty of some sort. A couple of differences I see in the warranties between AIA and consensus. Those say that the work will be free from defects. Consensus says work will be free from material defects. Is there a difference? Legally, I can argue that there's a difference between defects and material defects. So I kind of like that language a little bit if you're a contractor. And it's probably goes without saying that if someone brings you your contract and someone brings you an AIA document that says this is what I want, if you like that, negotiate that word in there. I think the warranties in both contracts are, they could be stronger for contractors. And it's always an area if a contractor comes to me and says, is there a place where you can boost my protection, I'd say it could be in that warranty. Both have a 1-year construction period. Consensus docs have a written notice requirement, meaning if you do want to make a claim under a warranty, it has to be written in writing. Under the new version of AIA, it doesn't, which can create some issues. The consensus docs has this, I'll call it strange provision I hadn't seen before. It says it has a provision for allowing the owner to come and seek a remedy for defective work after the 1-year correction period. It reads somewhat interesting. There's reasons to believe it could add some protection, but I also, as I was preparing for this, I have yet to figure out if I like it or not. I'll just put it at that. But you don't see that in the AIA contracts. Payment issues, I think I'll skip through these a little bit because I'm running a little late and want to let these gentlemen talk some. There was one issue that I was going to address for sure. The remedy for failure to make a payment, meaning owner fails to pay you. The consensus documents had a little bit of an additional language in there to protect the contractor that says that if you're not being paid, you can shut down work until you get paid. And then if there's costs that incur from shutting down or from delays from the construction, that you can seek an equitable adjustment from the contract price. Again, it's built right into the contract, which I kind of like if my client's a contractor now. And then this is kind of my last topic, and I don't have much to say other than I kind of thought it was interesting. You know, you got the owner and you want to know where they are financially. Consensus docs is a little more liberal when a contractor can ask. Although the 2007 AIA updates every 2 years. The most recent was 2017. And they've kind of leveled the playing field for contractors on what they can do, certainly when there's a concern about payment obligations. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Holcomb and let him hopefully wake you up a little bit. Thank you.
You can call me Matt. Everybody still awake? Good. Good. All right. So we're going to talk about change orders. I have a question for you guys first, though. How many of you have used consensus docs? I'm curious. Has anybody here used them yet? 1, 2, 2, 3? So the theme, if you haven't picked up on it already, is that consensus docs generally give, we think, a little more authority and power to other players. AIA is going to structure the power and authority to the architect. Again, it's neither bad nor good, just things for your consideration and evaluation before you enter into this contract. So let's discuss change orders. Here's your fact scenario. How many GCs do we have in the room? Good. Okay, so you're a GC. You've just been hired by a big city. Let's go with Wichita. You've just been hired by a big city to construct Kellogg. It's kind of a big deal, no small task. You hire all your subs, you hire an excavator, your excavator goes out, starts digging into the ground, and your excavator has to stop and calls you and says, hey, we've got a problem. What's the problem? We have hit bones. We got an issue. We have to stop. And you say, okay, what kind of bones? Not sure. Ends up the Kansas has to call the whatever it was, Department of Antiquities of Animal Remains. So it wasn't human remains, it was animal remains, and your subcontractor excavating finds woolly mammoth. I think that's what it was, a tusk. That's ridiculous. It actually happened. It was right along this stretch, somewhere here. So, what do? You've got a delay, because apparently you can't just grind up the tusk and make it part of the road. That's going to be a problem. So you've got significant delays in letting the state come out, whoever it was, and dig the thing up and put it over. I think it's in the museum in Old Town. Where's it at?
Where's that?
I think it's an exploration place.
Okay.
Exploration place? I was thinking it was at, you might be right. It's either there or it might be at that. World Treasures. Yeah, I think it's a World Treasures. So that's your scenario, right? So what happens in that context? If there's been a significant delay, you likely need to go sign off on what has been called the change order. Change orders are used when there's, I'm going to speak in generalities because I got to go quick. If you've got a change in time of performance of the contract or a change in price, you're probably looking at a change order. So with that framework in mind, I'm going to take you back now, because the whole purpose of this presentation is when you're choosing your contract, which one are you going to choose? AIA or consensus docs? You're going to go your own way. For change orders, let's look at AIA and consensus docs. I'll tell you, both of them, they allow for 3 different things. You've got general change orders at the top, and then something that we call construction change directive. Consensus doc calls it something a little different. But consensus docs, call them the same thing, but they change the words a little bit. So how many of you refer to yourselves as a general constructor? Yeah, so consensus docs is interim directed. And then you have, the third one is minor changes in work. Let's dance through these quickly. Who makes change orders? Well, under AIA, guess what? The owner, the architect, and the contractor. I put the section there in case you want to go to it. But under consensus docs, it's the owner and the constructor only. I have to look at that word when I read it to make sure I say it right. The owner and constructor. So again, the theme, architect's out. It puts more authority, more decision-making process into the hands of the owner and the constructor. Did I break it?
Yeah, close.
Okay. What did I do?
I have no idea.
All right, so change directives. I'm just going to throw this all up here at once. So in the absence of a change order, again, change order is going to be used for, hey, we got a problem. There's a change in time. I've got this stinking tusk in the soil, and it's going to take weeks for them to dig it out. I can't do a dang thing. Or substantial rains. That's what you're going to see a lot of too. Whatever. If you're not using a change order, you're gonna use a change directive. Both of the contracts allow for that. Again, you can read that, but the point is, under your change directives, under the AIA, it's prepared by the architect, it's agreed by the owner and architect before any change in price. And then there's this big long process where if the contractor disagrees, guess what? The architect has the final say. Okay, that's AIA. And again, some people like that. There's a place for that. There's some certainty there, right? We've got our arbitrator, our judge, our jury, all in one place. It's the architect. Consensus docs, it's going to be prepared by the owner before any adjustment, price, or time. And if constructor disagrees, get this, it must still perform the work and then submit its estimate for work. So that might seem a little risky, but down here on the bottom, you'll see the owner still has to pay 50% of the bill, even if it's disputed. So again, when I look at consensus docs, I think there's a lot more, I want to use the word protection that's being thrown towards the constructor, the contractor, than in your typical AIA document, okay? Minor changes, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I'm sure I have them all up there. Architect has sole authority to make minor changes. Minor changes are going to be outside the context of the Tuskegee, and actually, I don't think the I like using that as an example. I don't think it ended up being that big of a deal. I don't know that any change order was even required in that scenario. I don't know. But for minor changes, again, the architect has sole authority, signed by the architect only, and it's binding on both the owner and the contractor. But your incidental changes under consensus doc, your owner's got the sole authority there, all right? You still see the theme, pretty consistent. Let's talk about damages. Damages is a topic that can scare a lot of people. The takeaway from it, I guess, if there's one takeaway, what you do is important. As GCs, hiring subs, as owners, as architects, as engineers, it's really important. We don't want the ceiling falling down on us now. We don't want bridges collapsing. And what's a good attorney presentation without a typical horror story? Because fear still does sell, okay? So how many of you have stayed at the, well, it used to be the Hyatt Regency in Kansas City. Who's from Kansas City? You got one guy from Kansas City area? Yeah.
I lived there.
What's the name of the hotel now? What's it called? You guys know the story I'm talking about? It's over by the Hallmark place across from the Union Station. What is it?
It's not Embassy Suites.
Yeah, it might be. Anyway, I think it's still the greatest disaster of a construction design defect to date. It happened in Kansas City. If you stay at that hotel, next time you go in there,
collapse.
you go in the lobby and look up, and what you won't see is walkways, because those walkways collapsed. There were 3 of them back in the, I want to say it was in the 80s. You can Google it on your phones. They were having a dance down on the main floor. The walkways collapsed. 114 people were killed. 200 and some were injured. So there's your horror story. There's your motivation for realizing what you do is important. And so when you're representing your company for a project and you're going in and negotiating terms of the contract, and you come to those damages clauses, what you negotiate is critical. So let's discuss quickly what AIA and consensus both do for us for damages. Pretty similar, let me say that overall. AIA specifically waives consequential damages. I've defined them there. I'm not going to read that out loud. By the way, consequential damages is legalese, basically means a lot of damages. So if you have a contract that waives consequential damages, it's considered a good thing if you're the party that's being accused of doing wrong. Consequential damages is basically every damage I have as a consequence of your bad act, you owe me for it. And it doesn't take long before you start reading through case law to figure out consequences can just be outrageous. So waiver of consequential is a good thing if you're wanting to minimize your risk. AIA does that for you. Consensus doc, guess what? It does it too, and they're generally defined the same way. But again, you're going to get down here and you're going to see the themes that it gives the owner and the constructor the options to allow or disallow liquidated damages. Liquidated damages was interesting. Under the consensus doc, I think they defined liquidated damages as, the last words of it were, and any other damage is the words they used. So that's really freaking broad language. Watch out for language that says and any other damage. I'd like to see that one litigated. I'm not sure how. Liquidated damages, by the way, means let's specify what they are. Let's get real specific here. What are your liquidated damages going to be? So if you're negotiating liquidated damages and somebody tries to slip in, oh, and you're also going to pay for any other damages of mine, maybe a red flag will come up from this presentation that might not be liquidated damages anymore. Bonds, let me fly through this because we only got 11 more minutes. And Sean's going to talk about default. Bonds are kind of cool. AIA and consensus both require them, but consensus doc, AIA requires them, but consensus doc actually gives an option to require performance and payment bonds. They're still generally a pretty good idea. On go your own way option, let me say this quick and then I'm done. A lot of what I've seen in my litigation experience is over bonds. So you're a general contractor, you hire your sub, you go out and excavate or whatever, lay concrete, your sub hires 3 or 4 other companies, right? This is all construction 101. What happens when one of your subs doesn't get paid by your subcontractor, or they've delivered material and you used it without fair compensation, whatever the scenario is, and you start getting liens filed on the property, the owner's pissed off at you, calls you, GC, you better get this taken care of or we're going to have a problem. You call your sub, the sub's being difficult. Consider negotiating contract terms that give you the option to go in and clean up the title of that property up front. But if you do that, you can negotiate protection for yourself to say, all right, sub, if you're not going to clean up your mess, I'll go clean up your mess. Kansas has some interesting bonds. You can file a bond that immediately releases a mechanics lien. 61011 or 1101 or something. But it costs money. And it costs money to give one of us a call to go file it and open a case and go fight it out. But it makes the owner happy. So you're going to be in a scenario where the sub's not doing what they're doing, but you got to clean up the mess. So you go file the bond, you get rid of the lien, but then what do? What are your options? Well, when you're negotiating a contract, you can include language in there that says, look, subs, if you allow any liens to be filed against this property, that's going to piss me off. If you don't clean it up within 3 days after I give you notice, I have the right, actually you don't have to give 3 days notice, I have the right to immediately hire counsel, go file the statutory release bonds, to proceed with litigation, get everybody paid, get everybody happy, but you better fully compensate me for everything I have to do to get rid of that if you're not going to do it. So it's a little go your own way when you're negotiating those contracts, something to consider. That's all I got. Sean? Sure.
Last couple topics today, as we cruise toward the Friday happy hour here, is default and alternative dispute resolution. And what we see, what I see when I read the symbols we're talking about between AIA and consensus, there's a lot of similarities. But what I also see is kind of one common theme running through that I probably should have brought up at the beginning, and I think Brian touched on that a little bit. The consensus docs are generally written in a much more simplistic fashion, and much more plain language. I will tell you that if you want to fall asleep at any given point, go read the AIA Alternative Dispute Resolution, like 7 pages. It will, you're done. It'll put you to bed. Now, the simplistic language can leave holes, or it can create unintended consequences like Brian talked about. So again, I'm not saying necessarily one is better than the other, but I have a feeling if each of you sat down and read both of them, you'd probably feel like you left reading consensus stocks thinking, I pretty much know what that's telling you to do, I think, for the most part. And if you read AIA, you'd probably be like, wow, I need to reread that provision again and again and again, because I'm not really sure what it's telling me. That's very true in the alternative dispute resolution provision, in my personal opinion, when you look at the two. What's also true in the default and dispute resolution provisions is we harken back kind of to that deference to the architect. And they have this, in the AIA, they have what this is called either an initial decision maker or the architect. And it depends on if you're using AIA 2007 or 2017, or if you pick it to be the architect or somebody else to be this initial decision maker. But that can actually be protection for the contractor under certain circumstances. And the easiest to kind of illustrate that would be if you've got a crazy owner. A lot of the AIA provisions are going to require that whatever action the owner wants to take after providing the notices that we'll talk about and the deadlines and things, it needs to be approved by the architect or whoever the initial decision maker is if you choose somebody else. And so if you've got a very reasonable architect that you have a good relationship with and you got a nutso owner, then you may be in a position where that actually is much more beneficial to you than it is harmful. Alternatively, we hear everybody say frequently, obviously, that they would probably prefer, under most circumstances, that the architect is not the sole decision maker on what action the owner is taking. But it can be a little bit of protection if you've got a crazy owner. They both handle default very similar, just a little bit different in small respects. So AIA, if there's a default, this is your protection contractor for my GCs in the room, right? This is what you have to get from the owner. Requires notice to the contractor of default in a 10-day corrective period. And all that means, and you've probably experienced it in your practices, is you just have to start corrective action on that 10-day period. It's not that it has to be completed. Consensus docs is very similar, but it breaks it out into kind of a separate two steps to it. And they say you got to provide the contractor 7-day period. Written notice. AIA, when we went to 2017, I would love to talk with somebody and figure out why removed written notice requirements. And I don't know if you know that off the top of your head from anybody, but that to me is interesting as an attorney. And I would like to know what the thought process behind that was, because if you don't require written notice, then how the hell do you know that notice was given? Because we're just now talking about, well, yeah, I told him. I called my GC and told him. It's interesting to me. I'm sure there's a reason behind it, right? I mean, these documents have drafted over 100 years, but I don't know what the reason is. Consensus docs requires written notice, 7-day period, and then a second written notice that requires a 3-day period. Again, same thing. All you have to do is commence corrective action as the contractor. You don't have to have it completed. Termination for default. Under AIA, 7-day notice of termination of the contractor. In the contractor surety, it's required that the surety is notified. 2007 AIA version and the 2017 AIA version are slightly different here, in as much as who has to certify the decision. And one's the initial decision maker, which can be the architect or can be somebody else. And the other form it's just the architect, period. There's no longer, it could be a different initial decision maker, it's just the architect. Again, could be a good thing for you if you have a good relationship with your architect and the owner's not. Consensus docs, very similar again. If the default isn't cured, they don't have a separate termination notice period, they just harken back to the default periods. So you've got your 10 days, that's it. And if the default's not cured in that 10-day, the first 7-day or the second 3-day, then the owner can terminate the contract. And then provides another written notice, but not a timeline. It's just a written notice that I'm terminating it. Owner termination for convenience. Both provide opportunities for the owner to terminate the contract for convenience. Convenience obviously being not by any fault of the GC or any subs, any default. It's just maybe circumstances have changed. Under AIA and consensus, they're allowed to do it at any time. Doesn't matter where in the process of the project you're at. And they both require notice, again, one written, one not. And then they have very similar provisions for payment. And it's really not rocket science, right? If you've already done a bunch of work, GC, you need to get paid for what's been properly executed to date. and then some other costs here that might be incurred by the fact that it's being terminated for convenience. One calls it a termination premium, one calls it a termination fee. That's something you agree on at the outset. And that's just a lost opportunity type damage, right? It's if you're saying, I'm gonna have my crew on this project for months, and if you decide that you're gonna cancel it for no reason, no fault of mine, then you need to pay me some sum of money because I couldn't do another stuff. Termination for cause. Sorry, I'm flying here. We're happy to answer questions after the fact if anybody has any, wants to stick around if it's that interesting to y'all, but I want to try and get through it all for you. Contractor termination for cause. You obviously have some protections as well, contractor under these agreements. An AIA, 7-day notice. If the work has been suspended, for 30 consecutive days under 4 specific circumstances. This is where Consensus Docs clearly copied AIA on it, and if it were me, if I were trying to write something myself, I would probably steer away from the way they've broken these down, just because I think it's kind of odd, and maybe a little bit more complex than it needs to be. But if you've had your work suspended for 30 days because of a court order, or because of a national emergency, or because the architect has failed to issue a certification of payment, or because the owner hasn't followed through on a certification of payment, then you can cancel. You can terminate as a contractor. That's one avenue to terminate the contract. Then you have a separate section. And after a 7-day notice, if you have suspensions or interruptions or delays in the project that equal a math problem that's above my head, and it's like a number of days of the project and a percentage, and you have to figure it out. But if the suspensions or interruptions aggregate are over a certain total, then you can just give a 7-day notice and you can get out. Then they have a catch-all in the AIA, which I don't have on the slide here. And if the work's been suspended for 60 days, and it doesn't have anything to do with court order or a national emergency or failure of payment, you can cancel it, as long as it's not your default, of course. This is assuming you've done everything you were supposed to do. It's kind of just this catch-all. If you've got 60-day suspension for any reason, that's not your fault, then we're going to let you cancel it. Consensus Docs kind of pulls that all into 2 separate provisions. You got your almost same exact 30-day stoppage. It's the same, it's basically the same, a little bit different language, but if you got a court order or a national emergency, and that's the reason it's been suspended for 30 days, you can cancel. Then their next one is just all the catch-all. It kind of combines the second one and the other catch-all from AIA. And it says after a 7-day notice, an additional 3-day notice, so you got 10 days that you got to give them a chance to cure, you can cancel, you can terminate the contract as the contractor if the owner breached, and there's a few different ways articulated. From the owner's perspective, if they fail to furnish evidence related to their financial condition that you requested, or the owner assigns the agreement over your objection, the owner fails to pay or otherwise materially breaches the agreement, which that's that catch-all. If there's any other material breach, whatever that means, then you can try and cancel it for that. Dispute resolution, we're running out of time, so I'm going to go through this really quick. They both have a first step. The AIA is the initial decision maker. He's going to look at your dispute and issue some decision, whether that's the architect or somebody else. Consensus Docs requires the parties to talk to each other, and it has to be representative of the party. And then it goes to the next step. It says, okay, well that didn't work. Now we want it to be through senior executives that have to talk to each other. Now, in practice, I'm sure it says a quick call that says, fill in the blank. You can go pound sand, and we pass this step. But that's what's required under the Consensus Docs. If you still don't have a resolution, then you move to either a dispute mitigation or dispute resolution. I told you earlier, AIA dispute resolution is pretty comprehensive, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is fairly difficult if you're just trying to read it cold turkey. But the initial decision maker is going to make the decision, and then the parties can decide if they're good with that, and they can roll with it, and you're done. Or you can ask for mediation at any time moving forward. And then AIA has a provision that says, well, if you don't want it in limbo, that they can ask for mediation at any time. We're going to let you, the party that's happy with the initial decision, write and demand that the other party request mediation within 30 days. So you just start a clock on them instead of leaving it open-ended. And if they don't demand mediation, then within 30 days, your initial decision is it. It's binding and you're done. Mediation is after your initial decision. If you do it, you can't skip mediation and go to binding dispute resolution. You either do the mediation or you missed your window if somebody started the clock and you're stuck with your initial decision. You can't go from initial decision to litigation. It's not the way, that's under the contract, that's not what you agreed to. The binding is litigation or arbitration, which I'm not going to go into those today. Consensus docs, after your initial step of having to talk to each other, they have what's called a dispute mitigation, which is voluntary. You can choose if you want, in the agreement, you can choose if you're going to agree to do that or not. If you do agree to it, there's two different types, project neutral or dispute review board. That's either one person or a board that's going to look at it. It's going to serve the exact same function as your initial decision maker. It's just different. If the matter still is unresolved, then you can move forward to mediation. Or you can skip that mitigation procedure altogether and agree in your contract you're not going to do that. Then you go to meet, and then you have mediation as your next step. You do your mediation, and if that doesn't work out, then you can go to your binding dispute resolution, which is the same. It's going to be either litigation or arbitration, which you can agree to in the contract. And if you don't agree, then the default is litigation. Good afternoon, everybody. Sean Walsh here with Hinkle Law Firm, and we appreciate you watching the video today. And if you like what you heard, you can check out more at www.hinklaw.com. That's HINKLAW.com. Thank you.